Hello, Eorzeans! Welcome back to Remnants of a Realm. Today, we are going to dive into one of Final Fantasy XIV's biggest disappointments, the Diadem. If you started playing during Shadowbringers, you may be familiar with the name and the content, and you may be asking yourself why I would make such a bold claim for something that's actually functional. But rest assured, the road to that version was long, bumpy, and ugly. Let's turn back time to around 2014. FanFests are being held in Europe, North America, and Japan. Heavensward is just around the corner, and during the live letter in Japan, Yoshi P reveals information about the upcoming Free Company airship system. The system would allow free companies to dispatch airships to gather materials for use in another new system, Free Company Crafting, which would allow free companies to construct housing items only obtainable through the system, as well as the airships themselves, and upgraded parts to help gather more and better materials as the airships level up. However, Yoshi P added that the system would be further expanded in 3.x patches. Rumors immediately began to flourish on the forums. Could we be getting something airship related in the game, other than a glorified retainer venture system? Some speculated that the game would finally get an FC airship PvP system, which, believe it or not, was one of the hottest ideas at the time. Others were more careful with their predictions, expecting nothing more than a new mission location and airship parts. Enter Heavensward. The new system is well received by players, and the thought of where things would go next seems to have died down. The expanded in 3.x patches note was probably just referring to increased airship level cap, recipes, and gathering locations. But then, something magical happened. On November 6th, 2015, during the 14-hour anniversary broadcast for Final Fantasy XIV, Yoshi P finally revealed the secret during the 24th Letter from the Producer Live. The airship system was getting a completely new mode: exploratory voyages. While the details were kept somewhat vague, this was how it was summed up in the live letter digest on the official forum. I believe players are crafting their airships with their free companies right now, but players will finally be able to explore other islands themselves using these airships. This content can be played with several parties simultaneously. There are several locations where players can land their airships on the island, so please shout out to find other nearby groups and group together to explore. Players won't be fighting bosses on these islands, but will fight against a horde of level 80 and 90 monsters. Some of these islands will have stronger foes in the center of the island, so first you would want to gather all the parties together and then plan out a strategy. We're also planning to have several difficulties available for these islands. Players not enlisted in a free company can also participate in this content through the airship landing located in Ishgard. However, free companies will have some advantages, such as being able to select the island they want to explore, while explorations from the airship landing will be selected randomly. We would like players to decide which method they would like to take depending on their goals. Additionally, things like gathering nodes exist on these islands, so for example, players can use the party finder to invite guest members outside of their free company to enjoy the content, or go in with a battle class first to eliminate the enemies, and then collect the items by switching to a gatherer class. This content is unlike any of the previous Final Fantasy XIV content. We would like to further expand on this content by adding additional islands to explore in future. This content has been created envisioning an older MMO type of feel. And then came patch 3.1, and with it came the brand new type of content: exploratory missions, the Diadem. To enter the Diadem, you had to either use your FC's airships, or if you had no FC or your FC had no airship, you had to head to Ishgard's airship landing and queue up there. Unlike the Diadem you might know today, the original was a blend of combat and gathering. It was also divided into 3 difficulties: easy, normal, and hard mode. Easy and Normal could be accessed by default at the airship landing in Ishgard and FC airships, but the hard mode was locked behind FC airships only and had to be found through airship exploratory voyages. I remember it taking quite a while before we finally found Sector 22 in RFC and could venture into the premium Diadem content. We'll get back to that in a bit, but for now, we'll look at the easy and normal versions of the content. As players began flooding into the Diadem, it became clear that this was not what most players had expected based on the initial tease during the live letter. While it was true it was unlike any other content in Final Fantasy XIV, it also had some of the trademark Final Fantasy XIV limitations. Immediately upon landing in the Diadem, you'd become acutely aware of the time limit ticking away in your quest log: 90 minutes. For content that was teased as massive and facilitating both combat and gathering classes, 90 minutes seemed like a tad too short. When time ran out, you would not be able to enter the content again until 2 hours had passed. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. As soon as you began moving around, you realized that you could not fly on your mounts here. But then you spot it in the corner of your eye. That green glow in the distance. Could that be an ether current? Everyone's favorite feature introduced in Heavensward was the ether current system, which would enable flight in the zone when all ether currents had been attuned to. In the Diadem, the system was more or less the same. They were called ether turbulences, and you had to locate and attune to 3 of them in easy mode and 4 in normal and hard to unlock flight in the Diadem. Probably doesn't sound too bad until you realize that once those 90 minutes run out or you leave the instance, the progress is reset and you have to attune again every single time you enter the Diadem. Every single time. Your quest log would contain random objectives. Completing 3 of these would reward you with elegant tomestones. You didn't have to finish these objectives, but it was a nice way to ensure your trip to the Diadem wasn't completely pointless. The difference between easy and hard mode was the amount of items and mobs required to finish an objective and the rewards for completing them. So, what were you supposed to do there? Well, the Diadem was a large zone consisting of several small floating islands, similar to the current version of the Diadem we have today. On these islands were gathering nodes and crystals, as well as monsters of all sizes, including dinosaurs, roaming around. Gathering nodes would be spread all over the islands. Because this was a mixed zone meant for both combat classes and gathering classes, it would often be very difficult to reach certain nodes, especially if an NM happened to spawn right next to one. Even with stealth turned on, an AoE would still hurt you, and if you didn't die, you'd lose your stealth and death would be imminent. The monsters would have level indicators going from 1 through 5 next to their name, indicating the difficulty of the monster. The higher the level of the monster, the better the reward for killing it. Lower level monsters would drop bronze chests, higher levels would drop silver, and the highest would drop gold chests. Some monsters were so-called notorious monsters, who would have a unique star icon and was the highest level monster that could spawn in the zone. Multiple parties would be required to kill these and would always drop a gold chest. The chests would normally contain gear. The gear would be ethereal pink gear with randomly generated stats. That's what we all want, right? Random stat gear. Oh, and to make it all better, even the appearance was random. Because a lot of gear would become unwanted while exploring the Diadem, there was a system in place to deal with that. Sky Pirate Spoils. By exchanging Diadem gear to these NPCs, you would receive brass pirate spoils, which could be exchanged for items at the spoils collector in the pillars, within the Diadem itself, or the housing districts. When leaving the Diadem, you'd get a mission results screen, listing the time spent in the zone, enemies slain, NMs slain, and the amount of coffers found. For the hard mode, only accessible for free companies that had found Sector 22 through airship exploratory voyages, things were a little different. This content was focused almost entirely on spawning and killing notorious monsters, and locating buried chests. Killing monsters would eventually lead to NMs spawning, so the main focus for parties entering the hard mode content would be to locate high-level monsters and farm them until a notorious monster would spawn. Here is another problem with how the initial version of the Diadem was treated by the devs. There was very little information about how all of the systems worked. The devs wanted the community to figure it out themselves. This left especially the hard mode of the original Diadem a bit of a mystery. The biggest mystery was how NMs were actually spawned. As your party killed monsters in the zone, you'd eventually get these cryptic messages.
You feel a foul presence nearby. You feel a foul presence in the immediate vicinity. You feel a foul presence right on top of you.
These were party-specific messages and would not be seen by other parties. This allowed parties to know when they were close to spawning an NM. If an NM was spawned in the world, a zone-wide message would be broadcast saying,
"The air is thick with murderous intent."
Multiple strategies and theories were created for this mode, always veiled in a bit of mystery. The initial reaction to the Diadem was anything but positive. The rewards were a joke, the time limit seemed too strict, the zone felt uninspired, the ether turbulence reset felt unnecessary, and the hard mode didn't reward players enough for the work they put in. The gathering aspect felt tacked on, and for the most part wasn't worth the effort. The result was a sharp drop in players entering the Diadem in the weeks following its release. The Hunting Hawk minion, a Diadem exclusive reward, was the only thing that kept players logging in for a while. But even that, after a while, wasn't enough to get people to play the content. The official forums were aflame with feedback. While the majority was unhappy with the state of the content, some were happy, claiming it brought back memories of Final Fantasy XI's content, though many found the time limit to be a bit of an issue. In patch 3.2, the devs made the first major changes to the Diadem, a band-aid in an attempt to make the Diadem a better experience. Surprisingly, the devs decided to lower the time limit from 90 minutes for all levels of difficulty to 30 minutes for easy, 45 for normal, and 60 for hard. The number of ethereal turbulences required was reduced to 1 in easy mode, 2 for normal, and 3 for hard. A lot of other changes were made to improve the player experience, such as lowering the cooldown for re-entering the Diadem being dropped to 30 minutes, but the popularity of the Diadem continued to decline. The Diadem became the butt of a lot of community jokes as the content grew more and more stale. In Letter from the Producer Live, Part 31, Yoshi P assures players that a new exploratory mission would be released in patch 3.5. At this point, the Diadem had been completely abandoned by the player base. Entering the content was almost impossible without a free company, as wait times soared. In patch 3.5, the Diadem was shut down completely. The content became inaccessible to all players, awaiting a big relaunch in 3.55. The original Diadem was history. In patch 3.55b, the doors opened once again to a brand new version of the Diadem. The Diadem 2.0 was here. This time, instead of difficulty levels, it was split into 2 different versions. The Diadem Trials of the Fury, designed for combat classes, and the Diadem Trials of the Matron for gathering classes. That being said, you had to enter both of these as combat classes. In the Trial of the Matron, you could immediately change to a gathering class after entering, while you would not be able to change to a gathering class until all mission objectives had been completed in the Trials of the Fury. The Diadem 2.0 took all the feedback received from the 1.0 version and improved as much as they possibly could. In this new version of Diadem, the ethereal turbulences were gone. Your mount was ready to fly immediately upon entering the content. The time limit was set to 60 minutes. While it's still a bit restrictive, it's at least a full hour of content with no cooldown. The mission objectives were also overhauled. Missions now comprised of 3 phases, each with a primary and a secondary objective. The primary objective would often have the player approach a location displayed on the map and complete the indicated mission. Once the mission had been completed, the secondary objective would be to complete fates to fill the mission evaluation gauge. Yes, that's right. Fates were now introduced to the Diadem. These fates would pop up at random and would contain the same mobs seen in the original Diadem with the same 1 through 5 rank system as before, but they would now be involved in fates that rewarded players with a new type of reward introduced in this version: lockboxes. Damaged lockboxes would drop from monsters, which could be traded in for normal lockboxes from lockpicker NPCs. The lockboxes were loot boxes with random rewards. Notorious monsters would also return, now being part of fates as well. The map itself underwent some changes as well, introducing ethereal currents, which became available to players after completing their mission objectives, allowing them to access certain parts of the map that had been inaccessible before. The biggest new feature, however, was the emergency missions. At random, an emergency mission could begin. The weather would change to a reddish purple, and the text "Emergency Mission" would appear on the screen. Players would have to make their way to a special area on the map, and a large-scale battle similar to what you'd expect in an alliance raid would begin. There were several issues with this mode. Emergency missions were not guaranteed, and were very rare. Since they were so random, there were often not enough players in the zone. The emergency missions also ended after 15 minutes, so there wasn't a lot of time to get players into the instance in time to defeat the mobs. On top of that, the fights were rough and required player coordination across parties. It was the recipe for disaster. But these complaints are relatively minor compared to what came before. It really did seem like they'd made a real improvement. A Diadem Reborn was better. In fact, the ethereal weapons, known as Coven weapons, that dropped from the emergency missions were item level 280 and had a chance of getting stats that were best in slot for that patch. But that was also the problem. They had managed to create content that had a great and enticing reward, but it was locked behind a random event with another layer of randomly generated stats that may or may not be best in slot. It may not even be the weapon for your job. Still, the Brass Sky Pirate spoils still carried some weight, as the much coveted Pegasus mount could be yours for 99 brass spoils. There were also unique minions that would drop from specific fates in the Diadem, however, only 2 of them were unique to the Diadem. Pegasus Colt, which dropped from the fate Bloodwings, and the baby Brachiosaur from the Secret of the Lost Legend fate. Additionally, specific minions were awarded for completing the following fates. Embrace of the Serpent would give you a wind-up Leviathan, On the Inside would give you a Hunting Hawk, Where's the Beef would give you a wind-up Aldgoat, and Purple Haze would award you with a Paisa Brat. There were also a slew of achievements tied to the Diadem, including Crown of Thorns 5, which would award the title Notorious Monster Hunter. It did not take long before it became clear that the fates in the Diadem were just 3 to 4 types that were just copy-pasted around the map with slightly different names. The initial magic of the Diadem's relaunch began to fade. And slowly but surely, the Diadem began to fade into obscurity once again. The content would see very few changes and updates after this point, and eventually became abandoned, as the eye level of the weapons became obsolete, and since they had no actual unique appearance, they weren't even worth it for the glamour. The lockboxes became the only reason to visit the Diadem, but by 5.0, the glory days of the Diadem was way behind it. The Relic of Heavensward had managed to stay alive through 2 expansions, and this forgotten piece of content seemed to have become completely abandoned by its creators. But then, during Live Letter 55 on October 10th, 2019, Yoshi P revealed content planned for patch 5.2, known as Ishgard Restoration, and it was during this presentation
that he uttered the name veteran players had not heard in oh so long. The Diadem. The Diadem is getting a revamp again. This time as gatherer-only content, part of the Ishgard restoration system. And so, with patch 5.1, the Diadem closed its doors once again. For combat classes, the closure would be permanent. In 5.21, Ishgard Restoration was introduced to Eorzea, and with it, the proud return of an old friend. The Diadem was back, better than ever, serving a greater purpose. The Diadem 3.0 was a success. The world was no longer dangerous to gatherers, no emergency missions, no ethereal gear, and finally, the time limit was increased to 180 minutes. The new version of the Diadem also featured a freaking bazooka, known as an etheromatic auger, that players can use to kill passive mobs in the zone to obtain certain items. Weather effects that were present all the way back in the original Diadem returned as well, causing certain nodes to appear based on the type of weather. All gatherer content in the Diadem is tied to Ishgard Restoration's economy, meaning gatherers could gather items, appraise them, and then sell them on the market for crafters working on Ishgard Restoration crafts to buy. It's a great idea, and has likely secured the Diadem's future in the game. The Diadem had a disastrous launch, a difficult revamp, and ultimately returned successfully on the third try. For those that were there for all three versions, the Diadem will always hold a special place in our hearts. If you're ever in the Diadem, take a moment to appreciate the work that was put into that place, and all the history hidden within its floating islands. And thank the 12 that you don't have to go looking for etheric disturbances before you can fly around in there. Thank you for watching this episode of Remnants of a Realm. I know it's been a long time since the previous episode. A lot has happened in between, but I can assure you this series is not dead. It's been a whole saga that I'm not going to go into here, but the important part is that I'm semi-back to producing videos like these. Next time, we're going to be looking at Eureka, so make sure you like and subscribe for more, and leave a comment below with your own experiences and memories from the Diadem, be it the original, first, or second relaunch. Thank you to my patrons scrolling above me. I appreciate your patience. Until we meet again, may you ever walk in the light of the crystal.